The Tulsa State Fair kicks off Thursday, and a lot of folks are looking forward to riding all of the rides. But you'll want to be careful. Dr. Stacy Chronister, an internal medicine specialist with OU Medicine, is here to talk about ride safety. So glad to have you here, Dr. Chronister.
Yes, absolutely.
Okay, so we were talking before we started the segment during the break. I don't ride rides because they make me too dizzy, but a lot of people do.
I love the rides. I love the fair. I'm already trying to figure out when it can fit into my schedule.
Well, and parents may ask, okay, my kid almost tall enough, what's the harm in just having them go ahead and ride the ride even though they're an inch and a half short?
And I tell you, as a parent myself, I've been in this position of you're almost tall enough. What do? Do you tell your kid to stand up real tall, put your hair up higher, put some tissues in your socks or shoes?
Yeah.
But no, you really shouldn't. In order to get as many people on the ride and to maximize kind of the fun of the fair, they already have those restrictions at the bare minimum. So we really need to think about the rides at the fair being very similar to your car seat safety in your car and making sure that you are hitting the right weight and height requirements, because the ride is designed for a certain person of a certain height to fit into the barriers and also certain development stage.
Okay, so are rides safe for all children who meet the height limit?
Yeah, that's where it gets a little interesting, right? So if you have a child who is much taller than their normal age group, so if they're very tall for their age, I would actually consider holding off on riding certain rides, because just because they've reached that height requirement doesn't mean that their bones are developed enough and they are higher at risk for injury, similarly to being in the car seat.
So what are the most common injuries and how can folks stop from getting them? What
Absolutely.
do you do?
So neck injuries or neck sprains are going to be your most common. So if you have neck, back problems, absolutely avoid those rides that warn you. If you have neck and back problems, don't ride this. Absolutely heed those warnings. There's a few ways that you can help yourself to get less injuries. Number one is actually to hold on to the railings or to the ride like you're supposed to. Personally, I am a hands up in the air type of person.
Like to have a good
time. It's
time.
hard for me to give this advice, but if you are holding on, you are less likely to have all that intense motion. And if your feet are planted directly on the ground, which is why we really need to make sure you're hitting those height requirements. Another good way to really avoid this is make sure eyes to the front.
Okay.
Oftentimes you're on the roller coaster and you're looking out and you're waving at the family members who's trying to get your picture. It's a great picture, but it actually increases risk for injury.
Well, and you were mentioning, maybe you have a child who's recently had a concussion, and that can really have an impact, and you don't want to put them on the ride too soon after.
Absolutely, in the same way that you don't want to send them back to the sports. Think of it in the same way. So what happens with the brain is actually very soft tissue, and it sits within a hard skull. It has fluid around it, but if you move the brain too quickly, it actually kind of, for lack of better terms, whaps up against each side of the skull, right? And so if you are going one direction and then something suddenly turns, you are slinging it from one side of the skull to the other, and that's where those injuries are going to occur most. So if you've already had a concussion or recovering from one, already have a traumatic brain injury, you are leaving yourself very susceptible. Also, I always talk about the mega pass. I tell my kids, well, we don't need the mega pass. It's good for us to wait in lines. Because if you are going from one ride to the next ride to the next ride, or riding something over and over, you are doing that motion much more frequently, as opposed to letting your brain get a little bit of a rest, and you're more likely to get maybe some concussive injuries.
Well, this has been really interesting, because when I go to the fair, I just think about being dizzy, but had never really thought about the impact that those rides kind of jolting us around and the impact that it has on our bodies, especially young bodies for kids.
Absolutely, and at the end of the day, these are safe rides. We are more likely to get head injuries on our way to the fair, but it's really important for us to think about who is most at risk. It's those young children and those who are already at risk for having those injuries.